Yeah. Well, Audrey Thomas is all the lawyer I need. Whoa.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I am your host, Audrey Thomas, attorney at law. This is the Empowerment Hour, which is being live streamed on ctvn1.com. That's ctvn1.com. We are on radio 93.5 FM. And you can also tune in on tehrs.com. Ladies and gentlemen, the theme for this evening, Hurt is Never Past Tense, was created in honor of Rachel and Melvin Bailey, who recently won a tremendous victory in criminal court and immigration court. The law offices of Audrey Thomas PC represented them, and my co-counsel was Stephen Metcalf, attorney at law from the Metcalf firm. Mr. Metcalf, hello.
Hello, Audrey, and hello, Mr. and Mrs. Bailey.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Metcalf, Mr. and Mrs. Bailey is here in the studio with me. They wanted me to thank you for all of your assistance. I've given the brief synopsis about how they got to court. I want you to first talk about the theme for this evening, Hurt is Never Past Tense, and how it was relevant to the legal process involved in Mrs. Bailey's criminal case.
The theme perfectly synopsis everything that Mrs. Bailey went through. And I say that because from the beginning, when the incident occurred and she had to be arrested, the hurt began right then and there. And it didn't stop, and it has not stopped, still to this day, a couple of years later. After that, she had to go and get processed, and then go to court and stand before the judge. And I could not tell you how many times she had to go through the same process over and over and over again. We had to go, just appearing to court probably took more than 10 to 15 appearances. And each one of those appearances, the hurt was long-standing throughout the entire process. So from the day the incident occurred, throughout each court appearance, and then finally going to trial, that hurt intensified each time that she had to relive this situation.
And you know what hurt me the most, Stephen, as an attorney, and we're supposed to be completely unemotional, is the idea that I knew and believed that Miss Bailey was innocent. And I know this was a problem for you too, because as you were doing the legal research, one of your primary concerns were, how do we prove the negative? Explain to them why that was difficult for you.
Always proving a negative is sometimes impossible. I mean, how do you prove sometimes that someone did not commit a certain offense or did not act a certain way? But I agree with you that even though we knew in our hearts and we knew legally that there was no way that the district attorney was going to be able to prove these charges, we had to go through the process. And going through the process meant making each one of these court appearances, meant having to deal with the district attorney not being ready to try this case for so many months, and dealing with the whole legal process and trying to get the case dismissed on procedural grounds as well for how long that it took. So each one of the legal avenues in this case was extremely difficult because we knew what was at stake, and there was so much at stake with the outcome of this case.
And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand that although I am an experienced litigator, although I have been a prosecutor in Brooklyn, which is where this case was tried, I still enlisted the assistance of Stephen Metcalf because Mrs. Bailey's outcome was that important to me. Ego has no place in the law. Stephen Metcalf was admitted to the bar in October of 2013. However, I relied on him tremendously during this process. Why? Because at some point, I came to like Mr. and Mrs. Bailey so much that I was somewhat compromised emotionally because I was afraid she would lose. And in order to balance myself out, in order to find my balance and to get over the hurt I was feeling for them, I had to rely on Stephen because he would be an objective ear, eye, and mind in the process. And at some point, while Stephen started meeting with Miss Bailey and Mr. Bailey, he became somewhat compromised, and we balanced each other out, and we did the trial, I would say, beautifully. Don't you agree, Stephen?
I think the dynamic of you and I trying this case, it couldn't have gotten better because there was conferences held, and I would give my point of view, and I would give a spin on it a certain way, and then Audrey would come and give her spin on it, and I would just read the judge's emotions and his face throughout this, and we both made him think about different things throughout the entire trial, and I could see how that affected him. I could see how there were certain things that Audrey did that he really, really liked, and I couldn't do that or articulate those in the same way that you did. So I think that the dynamic was perfect.
And I think the best thing for you, Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, was the fact that there were times when I was out of the country dealing with other immigration cases or dealing with other clients or just on vacation. You had Mr. Metcalf to consult with. Wasn't that comforting for you?
Yes, he was. Because even in court, like when they have a break, he'd said, Miss Bailey, make sure you have some lunch. And I'd say, yes. When we get back to court, he said, did you eat? I said, no. And he looked at me with that eye like, oh, my mother'd say, why you did not eat? Yeah. And he said, everything will be okay. And the last thing he said to me, enjoy your summer. Everything will be okay.
Beautiful. And Stephen, I think that what we've learned as attorneys, and I'm sure that you agree with me on this, is that the law transcends everything. The law transcends race, gender, ethnicity, age, economic status. When you are in a difficult legal situation, you don't care how young a person is, how white they are, how black they are, how old they are, how rich they are. You just want that reassurance, that person to stand with you and represent your interests, right? And for Mr. Bailey, wasn't it reassuring to have more than one person to communicate with during this process?
You're absolutely right. Very, very good.
Yes, absolutely. And ironically enough, Steve and I balanced each other out, and they won. Not only did Miss Bailey win her case, but ultimately, as a result of getting a not guilty verdict, the immigration case is now going to be terminated, and she'll be restored to her status. And soon in the future, in the near future, when she meets the criteria, she'll file for her citizenship. But Stephen, I want to ask you this question, because I know that when I did my first couple of trials, I was scared and I was concerned. How did you really feel during the course of having to prepare the law on this case?
I wasn't scared at all throughout this case. Because I've been working on it for over a year now. I knew the ins and outs. In researching everything, I made it where I was fully prepared for every angle, and I contemplated out what I thought was every situation in my head. So throughout preparing for the case legally, and while we were there on trial, I was not in fear at all. I wasn't scared while we were going through the trial, and I think that it was because of the dynamic that we had and the experience that I've had specifically with you in court. It made it where I wanted everything to come out. It was about time that Miss Bailey had her day in court and that we were able to confront all the accusers against her. So I was ready, and I was prepared, and I was ready to go.
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Bailey can't thank you enough, right, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes.
So I'm gonna thank you for calling in, Mr. Metcalf. We're gonna wrap up the show. Is there anything you want to say to the audience and or Mr. and Mrs. Bailey before we conclude?
Yes, I want to thank Mr. and Mrs. Bailey for all the help that they did throughout the process of this case. I anybody who's ever come on your show, Audrey, who has been successful in their criminal trial or on their immigration proceeding has done the same thing, and it's been the same idea, and I want to emphasize that again to all the listeners and viewers, and that is a client has to also participate in their case. They have to work with their attorneys. They have to constantly be available and be willing to lend a helping hand in order to better their case. So this is another example of that specific concept that we are always letting everybody know is so important in the lawyer-client relationship. And I just would also like to end with saying that the theme tonight perfectly exemplifies this Bailey situation. And that is because the criminal process is very slow sometimes. You have to know that the wheels of justice are always turning, and they may be moving in what seems to be like a really, really slow speed, but know that if you trust the process and if you believe in the legal system that is set in place, that justice can be done, and that is exactly what happened here.
Yes, I can't thank you enough, Mr. Metcalf. I always look forward to seeing the good results of our hard work, and it's so wonderful to be able to share in the joy for Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, because I knew what the consequences was. Thank you, Mr. Metcalf. When we return, we will talk about where do they go from here.
For all your legal needs, call attorney Audrey A. Thomas at 877-LAW-NERD. That's 877-529-6373 or 718-276-2729. That's 718-276-2729. Audrey A. Thomas, super lawyer, super woman, super everything. Call us today at 877-LAW-NERD. That's 877-529-6373.
This is Stephen Metcalf, attorney at law, and you are tuned into the Thomas Empowerment Hour radio show. I want to remind you that this is a form of attorney advertising, and prior results does not guarantee future outcome.
Oh yeah. Now time maker with another case I had.